If a director retires, resigns, is removed, or refuses to stand for re-election at a time other than not being re-upped for another term, the company will have to file a Form 8K with the SEC within 4 business days. Oddly, however, a director's death is not a triggering event for a Form 8K today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. So from a Form 8K perspective, there are 4 ways to think about a director leaving the board. There are 4 branches on this decision tree. 1, the director dies. No Form 8K is required. A point made clear by this Corp Fin staff interpretation. I do find it strange that companies are not required to tell investors that a director is leaving the board due to death. I imagine it's because it's a tragic circumstance. Although not required, some companies do indeed go ahead and voluntarily file a Form 8K in these circumstances. As you can see in this example, when they do this, they typically do it in a nice way. They express their condolences. They list the contributions that this director made to the company. And here's another example of what an 8K along these lines looks like. Sometimes a death is announced at the same time that a new replacement director is appointed. That doesn't happen too often, but if it does happen, the appointment triggers a Form 8K under item 502D, as in dog. So if you have a combination situation where you have a director leaving because of death and a new director coming on board, a replacement director, you can file those both on the same 8K if they happen in a short time frame, and you can make the filing deadline 4 business days for the 8K. You can have 2 different items checked on one particular 8K. The 2 items even don't have to be related like this, where there's a director leaving due to death and a new director coming on board. It could be one of the other 8K items. It doesn't matter. It's because the market is expected to read the entire 8K, no matter what it says, and absorb the information in it. Even though a director's death doesn't automatically trigger a Form 8K, it may require a notice that needs to be sent to the stock exchange on which the company's stock is listed. If you're listed on the New York Stock Exchange, any change in board composition requires prompt notice, according to this section of the NYSE Listed Company Manual. And you also need to submit an interim written affirmation. So death does trigger a notice requirement for NYSE companies. And for NASDAQ listed companies, death only requires notice if it results in non-compliance with the requirement that the board be majority independent, or there's an independent key board committee, those composition requirements. And this does happen. Here's an example of a company disclosing that type of situation in a Form 8K. Note that an 8K is not required if a director becomes too ill to perform their duties, although the company's next proxy would need to identify the director by name if they miss more than 25% of the board meetings and board committee meetings on which the committees that person serves for the company's last fiscal year. Number 2, the director's term expires and either is not asked to come back to serve another term, or the director decides to retire from the board at the end of their current term. For this situation, no Form 8K is required. I guess the idea is that investors are expected to do the math, shareholders are expected to figure out that this particular director has departed from the board at the end of their term and has not come back. And so if they're paying attention from year to year, they'll notice the change. This Corp Fin staff interpretation confirms this position that if a company decides not to nominate a director for re-election, an 8K is not required. However, this staff interpretation notes that if the director learns they're not being re-upped and then resigns before their term expires, an 8K is triggered. 3, if a director leaves outside of the death or not being re-upped in the normal course context, then an 8K is triggered under item 502B, subject to one caveat, which I'll talk about as the 4th branch. If the director leaves in a huff, there's a disagreement with management, and then an 8K will be required under 502A. Sneak preview. Many companies have adopted board policies to help them determine and document when a director has resigned. This Corp Fin staff interpretation recommends such a resignation policy in writing. These policies tend to be short. It's good if they require directors to tender their resignation to a specific person in writing, someone that's aware of the 8K filing obligations that a company has. So in this Corp Fin staff interpretation, it mentions resignations being tendered directly to the corporate secretary. That's a good person to name, or perhaps the general counsel. These policies sometimes are standalone that aren't made public, but sometimes they're part of the company's corporate governance guidelines, which at least for NYSE listed companies are required to be posted on corporate IR web pages. And increasingly over the recent years, they've become part of a company's corporate governance guidelines due to a movement away from plurality voting in director elections to one of several types of forms of majority voting that are out there. These majority vote standards often come with a policy, a required resignation policy that's a corollary. I pronounced it right. Corollary, corollary, corollary. Here's one example of a required resignation policy in the corporate governance guidelines. And here's one example where it's just posted on the company's IR webpage as a standalone policy. Resignations emanating from these required resignation policies may well trigger the need for an 8K to be filed. Majority vote related policies typically require each nominee to submit an irrevocable conditional letter of resignation to the board as a condition for them being included on the company's slate for the upcoming annual shareholders meeting. This letter makes clear that the director nominee will resign if they fail to receive a majority vote at that upcoming meeting. Under this CorpFin staff interpretation, an 8K is not required for this conditional resignation, this letter, this irrevocable letter made in advance. So if a director fails to obtain a majority vote and the board accepts the tendered resignation, then in item 502B, 8K clearly is required. But if the board rejects the resignation, the company should seriously consider disclosing an explanation of the basis for that decision. It's urged but not required by this CorpFin staff interpretation. That's because shareholders are likely going to be mad that a majority vote was not obtained, but the board did not accept the resignation. They're not going to be happy about it. Of course, there are director departures outside of the majority vote required resignation context. And item 502B 8Ks only require disclosure of two things: that the departure has occurred and then the date in which it happens. But many companies go further. They voluntarily, but briefly, disclose the reasons why there's these amicable departures. There's lots of buzzwords here. Pursue other opportunities, personal reasons, health or age limitations, those kinds of things. And here's an example, a one-liner that mentions personal reasons. 4, if a director resigns due to a disagreement with management, disclosure is required on a 502A 8K, not a 502B 8K. This type of situation is pretty rare, but sometimes a director resigns due to a disagreement with management. These 8Ks can be juicy. Well, as juicy as an SEC filing can get, because the 8K has to disclose that there was a disagreement. It includes the event date, the date of the departure, the committee positions that were held by the director, and the relevant circumstances. That's the juice. And then there's a kicker, in that if there is a resignation letter or any other written correspondence provided by the director to the company, that must be filed as part of the 8K too. So here's an example that includes a director's email stating that he was leaving, that's filed as an exhibit to this 8K. And then here's the email exhibit itself. Here's an example of an 8K where there was apparently nothing in writing from the director, but the company disclosed that the director left over disagreement regarding a CEO search, CEO succession planning. There's even this twist that can make this type of scenario even more embarrassing for the company. The company is forced to provide the director with a copy of the 8K disclosure no later than the date is filed with the SEC. Then the company is required to provide the director with an opportunity to state in a letter whether the director agrees with the disclosure in the 8K. If the director disagrees and sends it in a written communication in a letter, the company must amend the 8K to include this new letter within 2 business days of receipt. Yeesh! One last point. If there is a disagreement, don't be cute and try to obscure the disagreement. You got to take your lumps. The SEC settled charges back in 2007 with Hewlett-Packard for the company's cuteness and a failure to adequately disclose a director's resignation. And then this CorpFin staff interpretation followed later to explain that a disagreement with the process chosen by directors to address a departing director's alleged violation of a policy regarding unauthorized disclosures and the board's subsequent decision to ask the director to resign is a type of disagreement covered by item 502A. So this interp is based directly on the SEC's enforcement action against Hewlett-Packard, showing that if you get too cute, you might get a CorpFin staff interpretation named after you. Let me know what you think.